Good afternoon. It is a distinct honor and a privilege to chair this discussion on transatlantic relations after the US election with two distinguished speakers. The Ambassador of the European Union to the United States, Ambassador Stavros Lambrinidis, and the Dean of our school, the Dean of the Fletcher School, Rachel Kyte. They're both very accomplished international public servants, global leaders that have made their own imprint in international affairs. I want to particularly thank Stavros Lambrinidis and welcome him to the Fletcher School. I will not even dare to try to enumerate his accomplishments in his long and distinguished public service. I know Dean Kyte will do so. But let me say a few words about the format. I think after the Dean welcomes the ambassador will make his initial remarks, and then Dean Kyte will lead the discussion with her own remarks and the first couple of questions, and then we'll get into the Q&A period. So our Dean has the floor. Dean Kyte.
Thank you very much, Professor Arvanitopoulos, and to Your Excellency, Ambassador Lambrinidis, welcome to the Fletcher School. To all of you, thank you for joining us today. For those of you in the Fletcher community, a very warm welcome. For those of you beyond, it's an exciting time to be looking at transatlantic relationships, something which is a cornerstone of our work at the Fletcher School. To have the Ambassador of the European Union to Washington with us today is a real, it's very special. It's a very important moment. We're less than 2 months before President-elect Biden takes over the reins here in Washington. He has signaled both in the platform he ran on and in his messaging since having won the election, and I believe in the appointments that he has already announced, that the US is back into a transatlantic relationship, which in some ways may be, and this is something I hope we'll get into, more recognizable than what we've experienced in recent months and years. But this isn't a moment to go back to something that no longer exists. Both the European Union and the United States are looking at moving their economies forward, struggling to gain an economic footing post-COVID. Both need to escape the economic malaise that they are experiencing, which is masked by stock market performance, but which is truly structural. I think that both are struggling to work out what a relationship is with the ascendant People's Republic of China. We have relationships which are complex with other parts of the world, including with Russia. Global health cooperation is right at the top of the to-do list as well. And we are at the beginning of a decade of extraordinary compound crises that affect the planet, from biodiversity loss to an ocean crisis to urgent action on climate change. So when Obama was elected, he pivoted to Asia. Asia is a different Asia now than it was. And so how the EU and the US together understand each other, understand how to cross the Atlantic and how to manage relationships with the rest of the world will be critical, I think, to success in so many spheres. So on that basis, it's wonderful to have an EU perspective from Washington. I'd like to hand over the floor to Ambassador Lambrinidis. Stavros, the floor is yours. We're just delighted to have you with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Kyle. It's a real honor for me to be here with you personally, and not just because you're the Dean of Fletcher now, and not just because you're the first woman Dean of Fletcher, if I'm not mistaken, in the history of the school, but also because of your remarkable work, including on the environment over the years for the UN, the Sustainable Development Goals and anything else. And always a pleasure to be with my friend Constantine Arvanitopoulos. We were we weren't planning to do this together as two Greeks, but we were in Greek politics together in different political parties. The deep thought, the brilliance that he's brought in everything he's done, I think is something that that I've always admired and always appreciated. Here we are now, after a U.S. election, and it was a historic one. There was a sense of history behind it, wasn't there? And we certainly felt it in Europe. I mean, we always follow American elections, we Europeans anyway. It's just part of our DNA. But I don't think we've ever learned the names of different counties in different states in such detail as we did this time. It was a very important one, and it was in many ways, in spite of the difficult messaging that is coming out in the post-election period, a celebration of U.S. democracy, an extraordinary one. I mean, during COVID, more people voted than ever before. They exercised all different tools of democratic voting than ever before. Thousands of volunteers were out there counting votes, observing the vote counting, canvassing, doing all these things. The U.S. media, presenting different points of view, live updates. I mean, it was just a celebration of democracy, really. And that's important because as we face the rest of the world today, we understand that we are in a values battle with many countries. It's not just an unfair economic battle that we have with China, and we do, both of us face this. It's not just even a military confrontation as we do in different parts of the world, but it is fundamentally a values battle behind it. And so for the US, the biggest democracy in the world, to be able to project a deep commitment to the democratic process and to be able to project that the system works is going to be supremely important, which is why we're following also now the post-election developments during this transition period until President-elect Biden takes office on January 20th. A second thing to note is that President-elect Biden is a dedicated transatlanticist, is someone who has over his decades of foreign policy experience and engagement helped shape the world in which we live, a world based on rules, based on multilateral institutions that the Americans and the Europeans put together, and a world that has served us very effectively up to now. In spite of all the need to amend and reform, it is a world that we Europeans have been at the front lines the past 4 years, playing defense to defend it, mostly, but ensuring that it's there, because there are many, many countries around the world who don't like this world, who don't like this multilateralism. They want to impose their own values, their own economic systems on this world. They are becoming increasingly powerful and capable of influencing it. And so it is very important for us to stick together. And that is going to be something that President-elect Biden and Europe will be able to, I believe, do much more effectively together. A third point is that we understand in Europe that the United States, nevertheless, is not where it was 4 years ago. And neither are we, and neither is the world. We do understand that this country, as came out in the elections, is a country that is in many areas a divided country. President-elect Biden has emphasized that he wants to spend a lot of his attention, at least at the beginning, inward, in ensuring that he brings more unity and more strength to the United States as well, which he considers to be a prerequisite for a strong US presence in the world too. And that combines also with a bipartisan, I believe, feeling in the US that maybe the US wants to take a little break from leading the world. It wants to be out there, and it wants to show much greater leadership, as President-elect Biden has said, than under President Trump. But nevertheless, a more united, more self-reliant, more strong Europe is going to be necessary as we build at a historic crossroads, I believe, the new Transatlantic Alliance. Europe has to, to paraphrase Kennedy, I suppose, we should not be asking ourselves, what can the US do for us? We should be asking, what can we do to make the European Union even more strong and even more united? And through that, what can we do to ensure that the transatlantic partnership is stronger? A united, capable, self-reliant EU is good for Europe and is good for the United States, and that's the springboard from which we come now in the post-President Trump era. This Europe does exist today. It is a different Europe. We have, through the financial crises and the very difficult aftermath of that, set up a much closer economic union and financial union in Europe. We have patched a lot of the deficiencies in the euro area architecture, and we are much better prepared to address future economic crises. Most important, during COVID, we took that a gigantic step further. We both coordinated with each other in a very effective way to address the pandemic itself, something that we didn't do at the first few weeks. We jumped in and we achieved immediately thereafter, ensuring that we together procured equipment, together funded vaccines, together reached out to the rest of the world to show European solidarity to others less fortunate than we are, at the time that other countries, including China, were running around trying to act like the Mother Teresas of the world. And we also put together a package of economic recovery that exceeds 1.88 trillion euros. That's more than much more than $2 trillion, ensuring that for the first time we will collectively borrow from the world markets as Europe, using the collective economic power of Europe, not each individual member state's economic power or weakness, to be able to fund and support the weakest countries in Europe, the ones most hit by COVID, but also a future economic recovery. We're going to be a much stronger Europe because we're basing that recovery on 21st century economic opportunities, not 20th century black economy, quote unquote, black, dirty economy. The green growth, the digital growth that we have set for ourselves, all 27 member states, is going to be a new dawn of growth in Europe. Just to give you an example, we have seen since 1990, our carbon emissions in Europe go down by more than 20%. And guess what? Our GDP in Europe has gone up by more than 60% in those years. For us, investing in a climate transition is already proven to be a growth booster. And we are at the forefront of research, innovation for green technologies, green energy. But there's so much more that needs to be done that we can only do together with the United States. And when it comes to foreign policy, we have kept a very strong and united Europe when it comes to countries like Russia, in the case of Ukraine. A strong and united Europe when it comes to supporting international law and rule of law, something that we have been concerned by the fact that the Trump administration appeared to be withdrawing from, including from a number of international institutions. We understand we're hard-headed realists in Europe. We're not a bunch of kumbaya romanticists, although, okay, maybe we have that a little bit. It's not a bad thing, I suppose, but, you have a great, huge competition out there. There are many players out there in the world, and they're very dangerous. And they each try to flex their muscles and exercise their might is right authority in their regions. Unless the EU and the US stare them in the eye and use the rule of law and multilateral law as the benchmark of what is okay and not okay to do, what you will have is players that will consider that if they can get away with things, including by using force or threatening it, they will do it. That will create a world that is going to be way too insecure than the one that we have today, threatening US interests and European interests. It's interesting to see if you take Turkey in the case of Europe and China in the case of the South China Sea, fundamentally their argument is the same. They do not recognize the law of the sea. They believe that they have the right, because they're the big bullies in the neighborhoods, to implement their own understanding of what is just and internationally legal. And just think of the great potential for instability that will unfold if international law cannot continue to work as the off-ramps for those countries that think that they can use military power. So a much stronger Europe in the world today. Also, when you look at the Western Balkans and you look at within the time of COVID, when everyone would expect that Europe would be introvert, that's when we opened negotiations for accession with Albania and North Macedonia. I mean, the European Union did not put in the back burner its responsibility to stabilize its region. But on the contrary, during COVID, it has taken steps, including to supporting with massive amounts of aid, the Western Balkans and other parts of the world leadership. So let me close by looking at what all that means for the EU-US relationship. Why is it important? Because we are by far the biggest democracy blocs in the world at a time when the world is being threatened by other countries that do not like democracy and want to peddle different kinds of systems. Because we are by far the biggest economic artery in the world. We account for more than 30% of the world's trade, more than 60% of foreign direct investment, more than 40% of the world's GDP. And it is, at a time of COVID and economic recovery, supremely important that we work together in this. And it matters because we do have the power to set standards. And I will explain what I mean when I look at the fundamental priorities that we have set for ourselves here. Okay, so let me go and close very quickly with those. I very much encourage you to read what was issued today by the European Commission, a joint communication setting a new transatlantic agenda for the bilateral relations and for the globe. It is a concrete set of proposals and on what the EU and the US administration can do on 4 main areas. One is COVID and beyond. The second one is protecting our planet and building prosperity. The third one is working on technology, trade, and setting standards. And the fourth one is building a safer and more prosperous world. Let's take them very quickly. COVID. What does it matter? It matters because it's killing people and it's not going away. It matters because it tests the resilience of our societies, including our ability to agree on common facts and to act in a way that doesn't simply protect our own health, but also protects the health of our co-citizens. It matters because it can go from a collaborative approach around the world that kills this pandemic, and that's the good side, to a selfish approach, both in the world stage and within our societies, that kills us. And when it comes to EU-US cooperation, we see and we hope that the US can participate with us to massively fund the development of the equitable global distribution of vaccines and tests. The EU has taken the leadership in this, whether it's the COVAX facility, 180 countries participate, and we want the US to take leadership. And it matters because we need to create a blueprint together of preparedness for the next pandemic. And that includes everything from looking at supply chains and looking at medical devices and how we get them to people, looking at eliminating tariffs on medicine and medical devices that are very important, to reinforcing and to reforming the World Health Organization. And it matters, as I said before, because we're the biggest development aid donors in the world by far. Today, we're the biggest supporters through our own money, our own aid of countries around the world, WHO and others, who need them to strengthen their health systems and to strengthen the social safety nets because their economies are suffering. We are the biggest, others are not. And there is a disinformation game going on, trying to use the pandemic also as a means to export a different set of governance, a story that alleges that it is authoritarians that are better positioned to address these pandemics, not democracies. And yes, of course, if you espouse our system, you will have less freedom, but what the heck, you will be fighting less with each other. And, maybe you'll have a couple of more PPE masks immediately there available to you. Well, that is just dangerous and false. and it matters for us to be out there and do it. Now, second major challenge that we have to address together is the environment. Why? Because as dangerous as COVID is, the environment is the big existential threat of our times. If we do not address climate change now, it's not a hoax, it's real. This planet will be in real trouble, and the dislocations, the economic catastrophe for billions of people, for our economies as a whole, and for the climate itself and life on it, frankly, are going to be unprecedented, and they're going to be supremely difficult to address later on. Not to mention by multitudes costlier than addressing them now. So this is where we hope to cooperate with the United States, and where John Kerry's appointment is so hopeful. The U.S. has to be a co-leader with us in this. There are a number of countries out there who have announced zero carbon emissions or zero climate emissions by 2050 or 2060. They include South Africa. They include the UK. They include China. We hope that the United States can come in and set similarly ambitious goals and align with the EU in leadership there. We need a joint trade and climate initiative to look at all these supply chains and other issues that have emerged, and to ensure that we create resilience of those supply chains, transatlantic and more broadly, that we decouple ourselves from the remarkable reliance on others for many critical equipment, but also protect international trade. We need a green technology alliance when it comes to storing energy, when it comes to clean hydrogen, when it comes to carbon capture and storage, when it comes to clean energies. These will require trillions of dollars of investment, and our scientists are already working with each other. We have to take the leadership and to have a green technology alliance. We need a green regulatory framework for sustainable finance. Let me just make clear, this is not just going to be a green growth that comes simply from governments. It is companies that are already in many areas taking the lead, but they will need massive financing, and they will need a very clear regulatory framework to know what is clean investment and what isn't. And the banks and the funds and others are asking for that kind of coordination. We cannot be out there, Europeans, setting the standards. We're already running this for years, I have to be honest with you, because we had to do it alone, and we had to get others involved. But now the United States can co-lead in this, and we can set common standards that will allow for all these technologies I mentioned before to be financed and to be boosted into production much faster than today is the case. And we need, of course, joint leadership to fight against deforestation and to deal with our oceans. I happen to be holding this. It was not a prop. I had it from yesterday's lunch. It takes 5 seconds to produce this. It's a plastic knife. It takes about 5 minutes to use it. It takes 5 centuries for it to degrade in a landfill. 5 seconds, 5 minutes, 5 centuries. Plastic today, single-use plastic like this, like straws, is the biggest polluter of oceans, and is killing marine life right and left, and is killing livelihoods of billions of people around the world. In the EU, we banned these. From 2021, these are gone. The 10 biggest single-use plastics. It requires coordination and cooperation. We have to do the smart stuff. And we didn't just ban it. We got together with companies and we discussed how to ban it. So we didn't impose it on people. We made sure that we created an alliance. Well, this is the kind of alliance that we need today with the United States. And I think that US leadership in climate is going to be supremely impressive and supremely inspiring. Now let's go to trade and the economy for a second. We've had a rhetoric the past few years that somehow Europe is an enemy on trade. It has been a false rhetoric. It has not been true. In fact, it has been tremendously destructive of the transatlantic partnership. In fact, we're the biggest trade partners and investment partners in the world. Our companies vote on that with their feet every year and every day. The US is the biggest market for US exports of virtually everything, and the biggest market for US investments. This hasn't just happened. It is because the EU is this biggest single free open market in the world today, by far, a market of 450 million of the most educated, most prosperous consumers in the world. And it became a single market because of the European Union. If anything, the EU is the biggest deregulation experiment in the world. I keep hearing that we are this terrible regulators, this bureaucrats, the EU bureaucracy, EU bureaucracy. It's amazing that everyone working for the US administration is somehow a civil servant, but everyone working for the EU administration is somehow a bureaucrat. I don't know how this works, but I'll tell you one thing. To create the single market, we took the laws and regulations of 28 independent countries, EU member states, and we trashed them. And we put in place a single set of regulations that allowed us to get rid of borders for goods, for services, for people. And that allowed a US company to go and set up shop in any corner of Europe and be able to trade and to invest freely anywhere else in Europe without the slightest barrier. That is the European Union. It's the biggest deregulation experiment in the world, and it's the reason why we are creating more jobs by our own trade and investment in the United States than anyone else by far, more than 5 million jobs, and where the US is creating more jobs in Europe than anyone from outside in Europe as well. We are the biggest supporters of each other's prosperity, and we've been so for years, for decades. Now, nevertheless, we have irritants out there. I'll just mention one, Airbus and Boeing. Airbus and Boeing is a dispute that is huge because it affects the two biggest industries in the US and the EU, the airline industries, right? Well, the airline producing industries, those who make the planes, but also the broader industry. And COVID has hit the airline industries perhaps harder than anyone else. There can be no stronger signal of reigniting the transatlantic partnership than taking off the table the tariffs that the US has imposed against the EU and the tariffs that the EU has imposed against the US, and instead sitting down and settling this dispute. And we have to settle it for two reasons. First, we both lost our cases at the WTO. So we both were found to be sinners, if you like, of subsidizing. Second, we have to set together the new subsidy rules for the future for these airlines, because frankly, they need support. They always will. They always will. As you're transitioning, especially to a greener economy, and as you're transitioning to cleaner fuels, and as you're transitioning to cleaner planes, the costs are enormous. And both companies, Boeing and Airbus, will need to be able to address those issues. And they both know it. And as we are fighting on this, China is building 100% subsidized aircraft with no one stopping it. That could be flooding the market in a few years' time. You want to look at a real economic, fundamental, existential interest for Europe and the US, that's it. So we hope that we'll be able to move from the general tariff war mentality and the contentiousness mentality against Europe and between Europe and the US, we can move to a much more positive trade agenda. Is everything going to be easy? No. Because of course, there are issues of contention that may take more time to address, but we both have an interest in a multilateral world and the WTO working correctly so that those who are basically violating all the rules cannot continue doing so. And so I hope that when it comes to the WTO as well, we can work much more closely together now. And of course, we need to look at, quickly, let me go to the third thing, technology. Now that is important because value's right on it. Whether it's 5G, whether it's 6G, whether it's artificial intelligence, the world is changing. And our world can become a much easier world, much nicer world maybe, a world that cures people faster because of AI and all that stuff. But it can also become a nightmare world if we don't have the right standards in place to ensure that the artificial intelligence cannot be misused. And we are already seeing its misuse, again, in countries like China with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, where face recognition and voice recognition and movement recognition are being used to repress. That's not okay. Who's going to be setting these standards? The EU and the US together with the biggest standard setters in the world. We always have been. And with Canada, and with the UK, and with Australia, and with South Africa, and with others. We can't do this. And setting those standards. So we are proposing in this joint communication also setting up a trade and technology council where we can discuss with each other all those things, from standard setting to export controls to all that stuff that is very important. Sometimes it sounds, very technical, but it's not. I mean, behind all the technicalities, there's so much politics. I mean, sometimes if you're going to be a good politician, I'd say this to your students listening in, guys, it's not just about a good idea. It's not just about thinking big. You got to think big. You got to do that. But at the end of the day, it's an ant's work to understand all the details that go behind getting a policy from the drawing board down to practice. And the idea is maybe 10%, the rest is 90%. You're not going to, if you're going to be successful in your lives, don't delegate this to others. Of course, you need everyone else, but you have to be leaders in foreign policy who understand that unless you understand your file down to the last technical detail effectively, you will never be able to be the leader that brings the change along. So you gotta be able, whatever you do, whether you're diplomats, whether you're politicians, whether you just go into the private sector or whatever, focus on the technical details. Sometimes they sound boring, but it is behind those details that lies the success or the failure of any great idea very, very often. Protecting our critical technologies is going to be a big part of the cooperation we're suggesting to the US. Whether it's 5G, whether it is critical infrastructures, whether it is ensuring that we have supply chains for critical materials that are controlled by people who actually do share these values. All this is stuff that you will find in the joint communication. Let me end with foreign policy because there's much more to say, but let me end with this. Democracy matters. President Biden has mentioned the idea of a summit of democracies and of returning to multilateralism. That is going to be perhaps the biggest, most important success immediate in foreign policy, and we have to show that multilateralism, that a transatlantic relationship develops. I am fully aware of the fact that the poisonous rhetoric of the past years have left many Americans and maybe some Europeans thinking that multilateral cooperation is a waste. It's bad for U.S. interests. The way to go is just go it alone. Every one of these issues that I've mentioned, whether it's COVID or whether it's dealing with climate, not just to save the planet, but also to reboost our economies, to make sure the best technologies are out there, whether it is digital, whether it is trade, all that requires EU and US leadership in the world, not just us agreeing with each other. But when it comes to democracy, I would treasure a discussion among ourselves as democracies. We have a tendency, and it's not a wrong one, to be looking at disinformation and everything that all the bad actors in the world out there are trying to do to undermine our democracies. They are, and we know it. But my concern is that we are too divided sometimes ourselves. In many ways, disinformation tries to create division, but also feeds off it, feeds off what is already there, tries to create people who hate each other, tries to create people who don't believe in any common set of facts or ideas or values even. And through that, tries to fundamentally kill democracy itself, which is the toughest political system, precisely because it relies on every individual citizen's following developments, participating in them, and deciding upon them. An authoritarian government doesn't rely on that. It relies on a few people making decisions and repressing all those who disagree with them. Democracy is not that. So we have to be able to sit and really think about how to reunite our societies behind a common set of values and priorities. Yes, celebrate our freedom and our individualism. That is what has made democracies great. But democracies have never been, I mean, it's always been in pluribus unum. It hasn't been in unum pluribus, right? So it's not like we begin from the same thing and then we all just go our own directions and hate each other because we're not exactly like each other. So if we're not exactly like each other, then of course we know we have to celebrate our difference. It's always been about ensuring that we celebrate our difference by bringing it together in a common community of shared values and shared solidarity. So I would put a great emphasis on that. And as I told you before, I would also put great emphasis on the rule of law and how the US and the EU can bring it back to the forefront, not as a nice to have way to unite the world, but as a prerequisite for which we're willing to stare down in the eyes everyone who's against it, everyone who's trying to undermine it. Yes, we need to build multilateral system together. We need to cooperate with each other, absolutely. But it is not okay for countries to think that they can get away with might is right. And we're going to be there, out there, through our values and the strength of our presence, and sometimes, when necessary, through a military might as well, and the presence of it, and through NATO, another big pillar of transatlantic relationship, to be able to ensure that the world doesn't go down that rabbit hole, because if it does, we're all in major trouble. So, Dean Kyte, Professor Arvanitopoulos, it's I cannot thank you enough for allowing me, a diplomat, but also, as I said, a politician. So, big mistake to let a politician an open mic. You know, they would run on it perhaps a bit too long. But thank you for giving me this opportunity to discuss with you and with your students. It is a really deep honor for me, and I look forward to the conversation.
Ambassador, thank you very much for this thoughtful and very analytical tour d'horizon. I will give the floor to Dean Kyte, and then we have a number of questions already lined up. So, Dean Kyte.
Well, I think just one question for me. Thank you for that incredible tour de force of every aspect or many of the aspects of the relationship between the two. And it was great to see that the new transatlantic relationship for global change published or issued by the European Union this morning. So my question really is just trying to pull together some of the threads. You talked about the need for democracies to come together and really, be on the offensive, as it were, rather than on the defensive. You talked about the trade agenda, the technology cooperation, the need for us in this decade to change the pathway of development so that we're more sustainable. The institutions that we use to frame multilateral cooperation, whether it be the WTO, whether it be regional agreements, whether it be the UN or elsewhere, these were forged, by liberal democracies at a time when they were able to set the agenda. The EU and the US need a bilateral understanding of how they think about a global trade regime, for example. The WTO is sort of, been weakened over the last few years, potentially a new director general coming in January, new US administration. Is this a time for the US and the EU to sit down and sort of imagine what these institutions look like? You talked about financial cooperation, the fact that the rules and regulations, you talked about the taxonomy that the EU has. There's no taxonomy in the US around sustainable investment. And then there's China with a very different view. Is this time to sort of hit a reset button, or should it just be sort of trying to make the institutions that we've already got work better?
Dean Kyte, I think this is a great question, and it's not an easy one. I think we should do two things. I think we should reinforce the institutions by being on the table and actively there, because if we don't, then others will be changing them in their vision. So we have to be there, reinforcing them, and at the same time, I think that we have to discuss among each other how we amend them. And how we make them better and more fit for purpose in today's world. In some ways, this is what we have been trying to do with the WTO.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the trilateral cooperation that we have, EU, US, and Japan, looking at the rules, for example, for industrial subsidies, and how it is that we can have a thought of how to amend the WTO rules on those, and then go out to different countries in the world and build the necessary coalitions to be able to apply it. You will see perhaps a blueprint of how this kind of cooperation, to be both present at the table and at the same time to reform, can work. Same thing goes for the WHO. When the US announced that it would be pulling out of the WHO, we were very concerned about this and very vocal about it. By the time this whole thing was going on, also the World Health Assembly was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And the EU was present in that assembly, and it spearheaded a joint resolution that got accepted in the WHO that included proposals for reform, and included also something that the US was using as one of the reasons to just get out of the WHO, including the obligation for China as well to cooperate in assessing exactly how COVID began and why it began, and how we can prevent this stuff in the future. So there are ways. At the same time, it's tough work. And I'm not saying that we simply should be going around assuming it's going to be easy, or assuming that we don't have to sometimes persuade, sometimes pressure those who are willing to be spoilers. And we've seen them. But we do have to work through that system, because if we don't, we're not the only big elephants in the world anymore. There are others. And if you go down that lane, you will see, and you can see, others trying to change. Look at what happened recently. I'm not going to comment on the benefits or the good or bad of this sort of trade agreement in the Asia region, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at it, there's not a single reference in there to the environment and environmental standards, really. I mean, that is something that is hugely important to us, because you cannot really develop. I mean, the thing is, you see, you can develop your economy by polluting the environment and polluting your rivers and creating cheaper goods. And you can also develop economically by violating labor rights and having child labor and slave labor and having cheap labor, in other words, and producing cheaper goods. You can do all that. But that's a development based on inequality, not on quality. And we have always been the continents that have been advocating development based on quality of a labor force, on high education standards, on high environmental standards, on things like that. So everyone following another route, I'm not saying this is what's happening now in Asia. I'm not saying that. Don't get me wrong. I'm just giving you a broader perspective of where Europe is coming from. Everyone following that other route in the past, discovered as well at some point that their own people were waking up and demanding something different. Whether it was people that were dying because of environmental pollution who said that's not okay, or whether it were people who saw corruption behind all this and said that's not okay. So then we went from the Millennium Development Goals back in 2000 to the Sustainable Development Goals, right? I mean, that's a critical different word there. The world decided that sustainable is the way to go. That, in other words, we cannot be focusing on economic growth or on social organization within our societies that is not sustainable. It is not sustainable to repress women and to be violent against them because so your traditions tell you and allow you. Not only because it violates the human rights, and that is an international legal violation extraordinaire to begin with, but also because really your economy and the strength of it, and your culture and the strength of it, and all those things cannot flourish if 50% of your population is repressed. Now, that doesn't mean that every woman has to be a dean or an ambassador or something else. It means that every woman and every girl has to have the right to an education and to the freedom to choose their, direction in life in the same way that men do. So sustainable is key. And when we look at reforming international institutions at the same time that Americans and Europeans are reinforcing them in the future, I hope, we should have this in mind as well.
Well, thank you. I'm going to hand back over to your countryman to moderate the Q&A. I think it's some important questions that will have to be answered within the US body politic. The US has not joined the Law of the Sea. It's not joined the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's not joined into international accords on rights of women. The US is, half in, half out multilateralism at a time when others are truly perhaps seen to be turning it on its head. There's some profound questions for both the left and the right in the United States in the years to come. But I hand over now to.
Thank you, Dean. We have a number of questions for the ambassador. Let me start with Professor Ambassador John Shattuck's question. How can the EU address its own internal rebellion on common democratic values? For example, Hungary's flouting of EU democracy and human rights standards and Poland's resistance to the principles of an independent judiciary.
Look, we've all had populism in our countries, and we certainly have had them in Europe as well. The financial crises created a lot of frustration. And I think that we have awoken in Europe to the fact that unless we address the issue of economic inequality during globalization, there will be a lot of people who will feel left behind and will feel very angry. And many of these people will not turn against their governments as much as they will turn against the EU, just because it's an easy target and because every government tries to claim benefit that, for everything good that happens, but also blame others for anything that doesn't happen good. Having said that, and so what we did, for example, now in the case of COVID with the Next Generation EU Recovery Fund, in which we borrow jointly in the markets, and we distribute that funding not jointly to everyone equally, but mostly to the areas and regions in Europe that are most hurt. That has created a tremendous amount of support for Europe among citizens that are being polled on it, compared to what we had a year ago. Brexit, in many ways, has also worked as a remarkable glue for the European Union. If you look at people polled today, the vast majority of citizens in every European country, everyone, including Hungary and Poland, say today in larger numbers than before Brexit that they feel the European Union has been good for their lives. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, political work, to ensure that the frustrations that can lead to frustrations also against the way that democracy works are addressed. At the same time, let me highlight for you the following, which I think is important. So there are legal processes under the European treaties, and they have been triggered by the European Parliament and by the European Commission in the case of Hungary and Poland, where the European institutions under the treaties have determined through their own processes that there is a systemic threat to fundamental European values under the treaties in those countries. And that is a process that unfolds. So there's a determination, that then there is discussions within the European Commission and the European Council, the member states, to try to address what has been identified as the deficiencies or as the threats. The European Court of Justice gets involved. So when it came to the issues of the way that the courts in Poland, for example, were being and the judges were being appointed, the European Court came with a decision finding that this was illegal, and the Polish government had to make changes. But these processes were launched. This is critical. And they were launched around the exact same time that the UK came with a referendum to leave the EU, which was a time that everyone was saying, oh my God, this is the opening of the floodgates. You Europeans should be very scared that others will leave as well. Why are you launching legal processes against different member states, that's a mistake. Just try to keep quiet, try to keep everyone in. And we determined at the time that no, we cannot do that. This would be the disaster of the European Union, because we are not just that single market that I underlined before. We are also and fundamentally a community of values. We came out of the Second World War after the biggest human rights violation in the world, the Holocaust, after millions of Europeans spilling each other's blood. And we developed a community that said, we will never, ever allow that to happen again. And we ended up being the most prosperous and the most peaceful region in the world a few decades later. The values are as important to our DNA as the economic development. And we felt that it was existentially important for us to, in our internal discussion, as it unfolds on the strength of our democracy in Europe too, to ensure that we stick by our own treaties and that we apply the processes that are in those treaties. This is, I think, one way, because you know what? The biggest danger in my experience in democracy, many people coming in and saying, when I was running human rights around the world, I would go to countries that, repress rights right and left, right? When every other argument failed, they would turn to me and they would say, well, by the way, Mr. Lambrinidis, who are you to talk? Who are you to talk and come and, tell us things, right? You have the migration crises and you have all these human rights challenges there, and you have different member states who do bad things. So, who are you to talk? And my answer to that was, you know what? If the litmus test for human rights were perfection, no one is perfect. But that's not the litmus test. The litmus test is, do you have those independent institutions in place in your country that ensure that your human rights violations cannot be shoved under the carpet? Do you have independent courts that can try and convict a policeman for beating up a peaceful protester, even if a government doesn't want it? Do you have independent parliaments, freely elected, where different members of parliament can disagree with each other on things, but everyone can voice their opinions on human rights in their country without fear of being imprisoned or silenced? Do you have a civil society that you may not agree with? Heck, I didn't agree with my civil society all the time. I mean, major NGOs would visit my office, and it usually was not to tell me how great I'm doing. It was to tell me how terribly I'm doing. I get that. But do you have civil society that you protect its right to be critical, its right to keep your feet on the coals? Do you have independent national human rights institutions? Do you have a free press? If you have those things, then you can talk, because those things will guarantee that your imperfections are not shoved under the carpet. And we in Europe today are talking, and we're going to have a democracy action plan issued tomorrow, which I also encourage you to read, in which we discuss about many of those issues: how to keep our democracies stronger, how to protect freedom of speech while fighting disinformation that is particularly targeted in splitting us up and destroying our democracies. How to do all those things. So I am proud of the fact that we have a healthy debate like that in the European Union, and that we managed to have it in a bipartisan, multi-partisan way. We're not two parties in the EU. Okay. That's maybe something else to keep in mind.
Okay, we have a number of questions, so I'm going to try to put them in clusters. We have a couple of them regarding migration and the current migrant crisis. One question has to do with what can the US do in supporting the EU to address the migrant crisis, and the second is how the climate crisis relates to the unprecedented movements of climate refugees, and what kind of policies can we have can we implement to humanely and ethically address the refugee crisis?
So if you look at the climate issue and how it relates to refugees and other such challenges, I think it's very interesting that even the Department of Defense in the United States in the past year or so has come out and has identified climate as a geopolitical threat and as a security threat as well, including because of the effects that climate change will have on societies, on people, on their economic development, on radicalization because of economic catastrophes and climate catastrophes, on instability because of major migration flows that cannot be absorbed by other countries, and all these things. And I think that's important, and that gives you a sense that even at that level in the U.S. administration, usually you don't think of the Defense Department when you think of dealing with climate issues. Even at that level, you're having a discussion. I think that what we have to do with migration is to understand that it has root causes, and that in some instances maybe our ability or an inability to act effectively may be fueling them. In other instances, our ability or inability to stop others who are acting in ways that violate economic rights or human rights might be fueling them. And to also look at what we can do as Americans and Europeans to mitigate and to address those root causes. We also have to ensure that we attack the business model of human traffickers. Human trafficking today is even more profitable than drug trafficking. And we do not allow people's desperation because of what their governments do or because of their economic conditions to be exploited and to be driven in situations where people are, massively trafficked and massively attempted to be dumped in other countries. We have to address war and conflict, and that's why what happens in Afghanistan and what happens in the Middle East equally are very important, and that is where foreign policy and where necessarily military leadership by the EU and the US is going to be very important to stabilize those countries and those regions. And you also have to look finally at your own obligations as major democracies in addressing the rights of migrants and refugees. And these are different categories. And I want to underline this. So economic migration is a different thing than people escaping life-threatening situations, which would be refugees, for example, right? We all have an obligation in the case of refugees to ensure that we individually examine their claims, and if they are valid, that we provide temporary protection. And the emphasis, of course, is on temporary. But we must understand as well that people who are leaving their countries as refugees or potential refugees end up very often stranded in the middle, in Africa and elsewhere for many years, not just temporary. Now, the International Organization for Migration and UNHCR are predicting about 8 to 10 years that people are going to be out of their countries when they leave. So we have to, and then when it comes to economic migrants, there's no international legal right to come to the US or to come to Europe, but there, making sure that we create legal paths for migration for the migrants that our economies need and our societies need is something that we have to become much better at doing. So that because in fact, you look at migrants and refugees today. You know what I find amazing is that those who object to migration, frankly, you cannot have open borders for everyone. I'm not one of these proponents. But every time someone is going to tell you that that person could be the next Al-Qaeda operative. And of course, yes, maybe they certainly are some of these people in the masses of migrants and refugees, but they are an insignificant minority compared to everyone else. No one is pointing out those migrants and saying, you know what, this person could be the next guy who set up Google. This person could be the next Einstein. But in fact, if you look at our societies, Europe and the US, you see how many of the people who came in our borders. In Europe, we had a lot of cross-European migration, right? A lot of Greeks who went to other European member states, a lot of others went to over the decades. And of course, people from the outside. And the US is the country that was built on migration. It's amazing to see and to think where we would be without that remarkable power of good. So it's not easy. It's not, let's open up everything, but it is follow your international legal obligations when it comes to refugees as much and as strongly as you can, and allow the international community and the UN to monitor you in this, and civil society to keep your feet on the ground. Ensure that you have legal migration to make sure your societies remain rich, and both financially and culturally. Deal with root causes of migration so that you reduce the numbers of people leaving if you can, and kill the model of the middlemen and women who try to exploit the situation for their own benefit.
Right. Thank you for that. We have a couple of questions. One on the euro by Christopher Brown, whether you see the euro supplanting the US dollar as the safe currency of last resort anytime soon. And one on energy by the Consul General in Boston, Stratos Epthimiou. Do you think that the new East Med findings will contribute to EU energy independence?
Okay. First one has the euro. No, I don't believe that the euro will be replacing the US dollar as the major currency of the world anytime soon. But it is already the second major currency of the world. So the second currency that is being used by central banks all over the world as a reserve currency. And of course, it's a supremely strong, supremely resilient currency. The financial crisis didn't touch it. And none of the crises since then, including Brexit, hasn't touched it. In fact, it is as strong as before, and it very often is even stronger than it was before those crises. We Europeans are thinking of strengthening a currency as much as we can. That it's the best possible thing to be able to complement the US dollar as a huge currency around the world for reserves. It goes without saying. That creates more diversity and more stability based on currencies that are based on freedom and openness and free fluctuations and all those things, and openness and the strongest economies in the world. So that's a very good thing. When it comes to energy, I have to say more broadly that what we're doing in Europe now, as you know, and we have agreed to this altogether, is we're moving to zero climate emissions by 2050, and to close to 55%. I mean, these are discussions happening now. It may be approved quite quickly from member states. Close to 55% by 2030. That's a huge transformation. Is a huge bar to cross. But as I said before, we're doing it because it's also a new growth strategy. That means that as we get to the carbon neutrality, we will have to use, and we do use, transition fuels, including fossil fuels. But we are weeding away immediately from carbon. That's gone. But we're also taking care of the communities that are being most hit by that. This may be a lesson for the US as well, as under the Biden administration, it also focuses on climate transition. I mean, we do have about 17 regions, I think, in Europe that are extremely reliant on coal still. And we have set up a just transition fund of billions of euros directly targeted to everything from transforming those particular regions to places that are attractive to other kinds of investment, to retooling the workers in coal to do other things, including alternative energies, clean energies, and all those things. So we didn't allow the markets to say whether or not they will allow those people, as we're transitioning to clean, to be destitute or not. We decided that this was our responsibility to take care of. And that has been very important in creating the political support as well for that transition. LNG is a transition gas. So yes, gas will be a very, very important thing. And the more sources we can have, and the more diversity, both of energy sources and energy suppliers we can have, the more we will retain Europe's energy independence. In the end of the day, fundamentally our big success will be the climate transition and clean energy, in which we are way advanced, more advanced than any other region in the world in producing and researching, developing. But storing that energy today, we are behind at. And if we manage to create the way to store that energy, including potentially through clean hydrogen, all these technologies will go way faster and will be way more profitable, and the economies of scale will come down way faster than we can even imagine today. Americans and Europeans working together in storage, whether it's hydrogen or batteries, that's going to be a big deliverable of our relationship in the future. I'll be working day and night to make sure we get our best minds, business minds, scientific minds, regulators together to make this happen. In addition to working on all the actual technologies themselves, whether it's offshore wind and anything else. So tremendous investment, tremendous economic firepower required, tremendous brain cell firepower. Americans and Europeans together can make this happen.
Okay, we've gone well over the hour, but let me ask you the last question by Anna Maizoradze. I hope I pronounced her name correctly. And this is on issues of transatlantic security. And how do you see the future of transatlantic security, considering the new US administration and Macron's doctrine and European strategic autonomy?
Yes, European strategic autonomy is open strategic autonomy has gotten a bad name here in the States by some people. But in fact, when you actually explain to people what it is, everyone says, "Oh, it's a great thing." So, maybe we do have a terminology issue sometimes in Europe, at least when it comes to American ears. We have decided as Europeans that we have to invest more together, research more together, produce more together, and deploy more together when it comes to defense. Our situation right now is that our member states are the second biggest defense spenders in the world after the US. But because we don't do this in a coordinated way, a tremendous amount of that money spent is wasted money. So very inefficient. If we manage to invest the exact same amount of money, let alone more money that we have been investing in the past years, in a more efficient way, we will multiply our defense capabilities remarkably. We also understand that defense is hybrid, and we also understand that therefore we have to focus there, not just on producing the big guns, which we need, and the efficient guns, which we need, but also looking at all these new defense challenges that NATO is also looking at. So we have set up two instruments, which again, reflecting Europe's tradition of creating names that no one understands, are called the Permanent Structured Cooperation, or PESCO, and the European Defense Fund, EDF. And these instruments are bringing our member states together to do precisely what I said before. Invest, research, produce, deploy more effectively together. We are in very close coordination with NATO. So if you look at most of the PESCO projects, they are projects that also reflect projects that have been identified by NATO as important ones. Military mobility is one of them. Again, getting back to the nitty-gritties of things. Oh, I want very strong defense, and I want to have great NATO defense also against, to protect the eastern border of the EU against, Russia, others. Great. How are you going to get the tanks from place A to place B, or the soldiers from place C to place D, or how are you going to do it? If you look today at the way that all these things cross borders, or whether or not you have strong enough roads and highways to support that stuff, you see that there's a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done. That's called military mobility. That could create days of advantage in getting things from A to B, for example. And that is the kind of project that the US Defense Department, our member states' Defense Department, the EU itself through its Defense Corporation now are working on. Europe has to be much more effective in its presence, stabilizing presence in its neighborhood. And if you look today, we have 16 operations, military and civilian operations in different parts of the world. I mean, heck, a few years back, piracy off the Horn of Africa was a big issue. You don't hear that much anymore. That's because of fundamentally an EU military operation that is there and has managed to effectively, eliminate it. So we are very active. We're going to be more active in that as well. And I see, if we are successful in this, I see this as being the biggest complement to American defense interests and to NATO as well. We don't have a Greek army and a NATO army, or a French army and a NATO army. Our national armies are at the same time our NATO armies. If we manage to make them more efficient and more effective, that means NATO is automatically more efficient and more effective.
All right, before I give the floor to Dean Kyte for the final word, I want to thank the ambassador for his very thorough analysis of the state of transatlantic relations, and also thank our audience both for their attendance and, of course, their participation in our discussion. Dean Kyte.
Thank you, Professor. And thank you so much, Stavros, for such an interesting dialogue. I'd love to invite you back, with some months into the Biden administration and see how things look then, and hopefully continue this this dialogue. Just for the audience members, I think that over the course of the next year, we intend to bring in a number of people who can look at the transatlantic relationship from both sides of the pond and bring different perspectives as we see how this relationship, which is so fundamental to so many of the challenges that face the entire globe, evolves in the period to come. So I'm looking forward to more of these conversations. I'm grateful to Constantine for his leadership, grateful for Nicholas to make the event happen, everybody behind the scenes. But Ambassador, stay well, stay safe in Washington, and we look forward to the dexterity of the two biggest democratic blocs, a country and an extraordinary experiment, the European Union. We look forward to you dancing a beautiful minuet together over the years to come. Thank you.
That's brilliant. A sirtaki, maybe. Maybe if Konstantinos and I have the upper hand in this, that's what's going to be. It was an honor and a pleasure, Dean Kyte, Professor Arvanitopoulos. Really, really, really thank you. And I'd love to come to the campus when conditions allow. I really would. And let's plan it. Happy to do it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.